Dub. A freight debt could buy a man's silence for a week, or a woman's dignity for a lifetime. It wasn't supposed to work that way. But in Pelican Cove, on the gray, salt-scored coast of Nova Scotia in the winter of 1887, it worked exactly that way. Nessa Brault had learned this the hard way. She was standing in the back corner of Cormoran's Supply and Dry Goods when it happened, half hidden behind a tower of flour sacks, her boots soaking through at the left heel from the slush she'd tracked in off the wharf. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be at the cannery, gutting mackerel alongside the other women in the long freezing shed that smelled of brine and dulse and the kind of despair that settles into your bones so slowly you stop noticing it. But she'd been let go 3 days prior. Too slow, the foreman said, though the real reason was that she'd bitten the hand of a man who'd decided her work apron was an invitation. So she was in Cormoran's instead, trying to calculate whether she could stretch a quarter into a week's worth of oats and salt pork, when Doyle Greer walked in. Doyle Greer, 53 years old, smelled of cod liver and cheap rum, had the personal ethics of a dock rat. He was her landlord, technically. He was also, she had come to understand in the 6 months since she'd rented the back room of his fish shack on the lower harbor, the kind of man who saw every kindness as an unpaid invoice. He spotted her before she could move behind the flour sacks. There she is. He announced it like an auctioneer calling a lot. He was talking to Cormoran himself, old Bernard Cormoran, who was wiping the counter with a cloth that had seen better decades. 2 fishermen in rubber overalls lingered near the stove, pretending to be interested in a coil of rope. Doyle crossed the planked floor, his boots leaving a trail of gray slush. He stopped 4 feet from Nessa and planted his thumbs in his suspenders. 3 months arrears, he said, not to her, to the room, to nobody in particular. She's been sleeping under my roof on good faith, and now she tells me she's lost her berth at the cannery. He shook his head slowly, the theatrical gravity of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own grievance. I have a debt to collect. Nessa didn't speak. She had learned a long time ago that speaking in situations like this only gave men more material to work with. The way I see it, Doyle continued, I'll take what she owes me out in labor. Cook clean whatever the house needs. 5 years ought to square it. The silence in the shop was the particular silence of men who disapproved, but had decided disapproval was not worth the trouble. Bernard Cormoran kept wiping the counter. The fisherman kept looking at the rope. Nessa felt the edges of the room sharpen. She was calculating the same way she'd calculated the quarter and the oats, quietly, precisely, without letting anything show on her face. Her options were not good. She had no family within 500 miles. She had no money. Outside, the January wind off the Atlantic was the kind that killed. The door opened. Cold air drove in hard off the harbor, carrying the smell of tar and ice water. The man who entered had to turn sideways to fit his shoulders through the frame. He wore a fisherman's oilskin coat so stiff with salt and weather it had taken on the texture of bark. His hair was dark, shot through with premature gray at the temples, and he had the face of someone who had spent years arguing with the sea and occasionally losing. He was carrying a crate of empty preserve jars, and he set them on the counter without looking at anyone. Trout, he said to Bernard, and 2 pounds of black tea. His name was Stellan Voss. Nessa knew him the way everyone in Pelican Cove knew everyone, by occupation and silence. He ran a boat out of the north end of the harbor. He kept to himself with the kind of consistency that had stopped seeming antisocial and started seeming structural, like it was load-bearing. He had no wife. He had no obvious friends. He appeared in town maybe once a fortnight for supplies and disappeared back up the coast road within the hour. He was reaching into his coat for money when Doyle's voice filled the room again. "You hear me, girl? I said 5 years is a fair arrangement, given the circumstances." Stellan's hand stopped inside his coat. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood there with his back to the room for a moment that stretched 3 seconds too long. Then he turned slowly and looked at Doyle, and then at Nessa, and then at the space between them, and then at nothing in particular, his dark eyes running the calculation the same way she had. "What's the debt?" he asked. His voice was low, not soft, low like a timber beam. The kind of voice that didn't ask questions twice. Doyle blinked. "None of your concern, Voss. What's the number?" A pause. Doyle named a figure that was inflated by at least a third, because that was the kind of man he was. Stellan looked at Nessa once more. Above. She looked back at him and felt the particular animal clarity of someone trying to read whether a situation is about to become safer or more dangerous. His expression gave her nothing. It was a working face, closed and weathered, like the hull of his boat. He reached into the deep inner pocket of his oilskin. He pulled out a worn canvas billfold. He counted out bills on Bernard Cormoran's counter with the flat, methodical precision of a man paying a ferry toll. He picked up the stack, crossed the room, and held it out to Doyle Greer. Doyle stared at it. "That clears her debt," Stellan said. Doyle's jaw worked. "Now wait a minute. This isn't." "It clears the debt," Stellan repeated. The second time it wasn't louder. It was quieter, and somehow that was worse. Doyle took the money. Stellan turned to Nessa. He didn't offer his hand or explain himself or say a single word of reassurance. He just looked at her and said, "I've got a boat that needs caulking and a winter's worth of preserves that need labeling. If you want work, I'll drive you up the coast road." It was not a rescue, exactly. It didn't feel like one. It felt like a transaction in the way that all survival feels like a transaction when you're desperate enough. But outside the wind was cutting in off Chedabucto Bay like a blade, and Nessa Brault was 22 years old with $4 and a pair of boots with a hole in them, and she was not in a position to examine the horse's teeth. "All right," she said. She followed him out into the gray January afternoon. His truck was a battered 1924 Ford with a cracked passenger window and a tartan blanket on the seat that smelled of dog and engine oil. He drove without speaking. The coast road climbed north along the cliff edge, the sea hammering the rocks below in long, slow detonations. Snow lay in the fields in the exhausted gray-white of late January, and the spruce trees leaned east from decades of prevailing wind. Nessa sat with her hands in her lap and stared at the road and tried to make herself calm. She was not calm. She was running the numbers again, the way she always ran the numbers when she was frightened. An old habit from a childhood that had required a lot of counting as a coping strategy. She was calculating what she had just agreed to and what it would cost her. He hadn't said. That was the thing. He hadn't said what he wanted in return. He'd said work, caulking, labels. But men who spent money on women without saying why didn't usually mean caulking. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He drove the way he moved, with a minimum of effort. No performance, hands loose on the wheel. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't trying to make conversation. His attention was on the road, and it seemed genuine rather than strategic. He could have said what he expected on the way to the truck, and he hadn't. She filed that away. The property was a working farm that had stopped being a farm and became something more solitary. A woodlot, a fish shed, a house that had been built by someone with the ambition of a large family, and then gradually stripped of that ambition over time until it was just shelter. Functional and quiet and slightly sad in the way that large empty spaces always are. He showed her the fish shed, the long wooden table with the labels and the ink roller press, the shelves of smoked trout and pickled fiddleheads in jars. He showed her where the caulking tools were kept and drew her a diagram on the back of an invoice of the planking seams on the boat's hull that had been weeping all autumn. He showed her the wood stove in the kitchen and the cast iron pot on the back burner and the shelf where the coffee was kept. He pointed to a door at the end of the hall. "That's yours. The latch works. There's an extra blanket in the chest at the foot of the bed." Then he went outside, and she heard the sound of the axe starting up in the woodlot. Nessa stood in the kitchen for a moment, her soaked boot leaking onto the linoleum. She looked at the door at the end of the hall. Then she looked at the one she hadn't been shown, which she assumed was his. She looked at the distance between them. She went to the window and watched him splitting wood in the fading afternoon light. He worked with the same economy of motion as everything else he did. No wasted arc, no wasted breath. The maul came down and the round split, and he stacked it and reached for the next one without pausing. She couldn't read him. She had spent her entire adult life learning to read men. It was a survival skill, not a preference, and she could not read Stellan Voss. That made her more nervous than Doyle Greer had. She was still standing at the window when he came back inside 20 minutes later. He knocked the snow off his boots on the step, hung up his oilskin, and moved to the stove without looking at her. He added wood. He picked up the pot. Sit down, Nessa said. He turned around. He looked at her. She had moved from the window to the center of the kitchen, above. She had her arms at her sides, which was a choice. She wanted to fold them, wanted to put something between herself and the room, but she'd learned that crossed arms got read as defiance and defiance got punished. So she kept them at her sides and stood straight and met his eyes. I need to know what you want. He set the pot back on the stove. I told you, the boat, not the boat. She kept her voice flat, businesslike. She had long ago learned to remove the trembling from her voice before it reached her mouth, though it cost her. I need to know what you're going to want, at night. So I can decide now whether I say yes and we skip this part, or whether you're going to have to hurt me to get it, because I'd rather know the schedule in advance. I don't do well with surprises. The kitchen was very quiet. The wood stove ticked. Stellan Voss looked at her for a long time with an expression she couldn't parse. Not anger, not the particular smug satisfaction of a man whose plan had been correctly identified. Not even pity, which would have been the worst of the options. It was something more complicated and more painful to witness, something that looked like a man being made to see a room he'd been trying not to look at for a long time. He sat down at the kitchen table, not because she'd told him to, because his legs seemed to need the chair. He pressed the heels of his hands against the table's edge. No, he said. His voice came out rough, like it had caught on something on the way up. That's not no. Nessa didn't move. I paid Greer's debt because what he was doing was wrong, Stellan said slowly, as if he were translating from a language he was still learning. Not because I wanted anything from you. The work is real. The boat needs it. But it's a job, and you can leave whenever you want, and... He stopped. He looked at the table. And I'm sorry that you had to ask that question. I'm sorry that's the question the situation required you to ask. She looked at him for a long time. Men always lied. She knew that the way she knew the tides, not as a belief, but as a demonstrated pattern, empirical and reliable, above. But there was something in the way he'd said it. Not smooth, halting, uncertain. The lie she'd learned to expect was always fluent, always practiced. This was something rougher and less convenient. She walked to the table and pulled out the opposite chair and sat down. Show me the boat diagram again, she said. He looked up. The caulking, she said. Show me what you need. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced the invoice. He unfolded it on the table between them and spread it flat with his palm. And he started talking about planking and oakum and the particular vulnerability of the bow seam in cold weather. And she listened, and the wood stove crackled, and outside the January wind moved across the harbor, and the snow kept falling in the thin, patient way it falls on the Nova Scotia coast when it intends to stay. She did not feel safe. She did not trust him. But she was sitting at a table in a warm kitchen with a man who was talking to her about boats, and for the first time in 3 months, no one was taking inventory of what she owed. That was something. It wasn't much, but it was something. By February, the pattern of the house had established itself the way patterns do, not through agreement but through repetition, each day laying itself over the one before until the grooves deepened into habit. Nessa rose before 6 and had the stove going and the coffee made by the time Stellan came in from checking the boat lines. He cooked dinner most nights, which surprised her. Not the cooking itself, but the competence of it. The quiet, methodical way he moved around the kitchen, like a man who'd been feeding himself a long time and had made his peace with it. She worked on the fish shed labels in the mornings, her handwriting growing more confident on the jars as the weeks passed. In the afternoons, she learned the boat. He showed her the caulking tools with the same patient economy he brought to everything, crouching beside the hull in the cold shed and running his thumb along a seam to show her what weeping looked like from the inside. He talked more than she'd expected. Not socially. He still had no small talk, and silence between them was frequent and comfortable in a way she hadn't anticipated. But he talked about the coast, about the tides and the fish runs, and the particular character of winter storms coming off the Laurentian Channel. He talked about the spruce bark beetles that were moving through the woodlot and what it would mean for the timber in 10 years. He talked like a man who'd spent a long time talking to himself and was slightly surprised to discover there was someone there to answer. She told him almost nothing about herself. He didn't ask. She filed that away too, the not asking, and what it meant, which she still wasn't certain of. The first time she laughed was the third week of February. He was attempting to fix the kitchen tap, which had begun dripping the previous Thursday, and he had by degrees dismantled a larger and larger portion of the plumbing infrastructure in pursuit of the original problem, until the kitchen floor was covered in pipes and washers, and he was lying on his back under the sink with his boots sticking out, saying nothing, which was somehow louder than swearing. Nessa looked at the boots. She looked at the parts on the floor. She looked at the increasingly small tap and the increasingly large disaster surrounding it. She started laughing. She didn't mean to. It came up from somewhere below her sternum and arrived without permission, a short, startled sound. She put her hand over her mouth. Stellan's boots stopped moving. There was a silence from under the sink. Then his voice came up, flat and muffled. "I had it under control." And she laughed again, longer this time. And after a moment she heard something that might have been a quiet exhale from under the sink, that might have been a laugh, though she couldn't be certain. She did not examine the feeling. She covered it back up and went to put the kettle on. But she noticed it. It was warm and small and terrifying, like a coal in a snowbank. The trouble arrived on the last Saturday in February, just after noon. Nessa was in the fish shed when she heard the crunch of tires on the frozen gravel track. She looked out the shed's small window and saw a dark green truck she didn't recognize pull up beside the woodpile. Two men got out. She recognized one of them from the posture before she saw the face. The particular self-satisfied roll of Doyle Greer's shoulders, the way he walked like a man who thought the ground owed him a favor. The other man was broader, with a flat, closed face, and the kind of stillness that meant he was used to being the reason things escalated. Nessa set down the label roller. She had three options. She ran them quickly and quietly, the way she always did. She heard Stellan's axe stop in the woodlot. A minute later his boots were on the porch, and the door opened, and she heard Doyle's voice carry across the yard in the cold, clear air. "Thought I'd come see how the arrangement's working out." Nessa moved to the shed door and opened it a crack. Stellan was standing on the porch with his maul still in his hand, not threateningly, just because he'd been holding it and saw no reason to put it down. He was looking at the two men in the yard, with the flat expression he brought to machinery that wasn't working correctly. "Debt's paid," he said. "There's no arrangement." Doyle smiled. His smile was the kind that started in the wrong part of the face. "See, the thing is, I got to thinking. What I sold Voss wasn't a debt. What I sold him was the girl. And the price I got for her wasn't what she's actually worth, given what she knows about my business dealings at the harbor office." He paused for effect. "I'd like her back, or I'd like the difference paid. One or the other." Nessa felt the cold go out of the air and something simpler replace it. The broad man reached inside his coat. What happened next happened fast enough that she processed it in pieces afterward, out of order. The broad man's hand came out of his coat, and Stellan moved off the porch, not toward the man with the weapon but sideways, cutting the angle, using the truck as cover, and in the same motion he threw them all. Not at anyone. He threw it at the broad man's vehicle with a sound like a cannon, and the passenger window exploded inward, and in the half-second of collective flinching that followed, Stellan closed the distance and had the broad man's wrist in both hands. And there was a short, ugly sound, and the gun dropped into the snow. Doyle scrambled backward toward his truck. Nessa came out of the fish shed. She wasn't sure afterward why she came out. She'd told herself for years that the smartest thing a woman in her position could do was make herself small, make herself invisible, wait for the danger to pass. She had believed that. She had lived by it. But she came out of the shed anyway, with the cast-iron label weight from the shed table in her right hand, and she put herself between Doyle Greer and the porch steps and looked at him. She was aware she was shaking. She was shaking, and she was standing there anyway, and that was the distinction she understood later. Not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let it be the only thing speaking. "You don't have a claim," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "You settled the debt for cash money in front of Bernard Cormoran and two witnesses. You do not have a claim." Doyle stared at her. Behind him, the broad man was sitting in the snow, making a sound that was not dignified, and Stellan was standing with his arms at his sides, breathing hard, watching. Doyle looked at Nessa for a long moment. He looked at the cast-iron weight in her hand. He looked at the broad man in the snow. He got back in his truck. The tires spun on the ice and then caught, and the truck went back down the coast road, and the sound of the engine faded until there was only the wind off the water and the ringing silence of the cleared yard. Stellan walked across the snow toward her. His shoulder was moving wrong. She could see it in the careful way he held his arm, the 2 inches of missing swing on the right side. He'd caught something. The edge of the truck door or the mall's kick, she wasn't certain. She met him halfway. "You're hurt," she said. He looked down at his shoulder like he was checking the assessment against his own data. "It'll do. It won't." She took his arm, his good arm, the left, and turned him toward the house. He didn't resist. That surprised her more than the rest of it. Inside, she sat him at the kitchen table and pulled his coat off, and he cooperated with this with the same quiet stubbornness he brought to everything. Not complaining, not flinching away. Just slightly unhelpful in the way of a man who wasn't used to being tended to and didn't know quite where to put himself. The shoulder was bruised badly down into the trapezius, already darkening toward purple. Not broken. She'd seen broken. She got the medicine tin from the shelf. She'd found it the first week and memorized its contents. Another old habit. And she found the liniment and the bandaging cloth. She wrapped the shoulder with the efficiency of someone who'd had occasion to learn how. He sat very still the entire time. When she leaned across him to secure the bandage, she could feel him holding his breath, not in pain. The intake of breath for pain was different, sharper, but in the particular suspended stillness of a man trying not to disturb something. She sat back and looked at him. "You came out of the shed," he said. "I did. You didn't have to." She put the liniment back in the tin. She thought about how to say it and then decided not to dress it. "You were alone out there." He looked at her for a moment. His dark eyes were very direct, the way they always were, without the deflecting quality she'd come to expect from men who were guilty of something. He lifted his good hand and touched her face. Just the back of 2 fingers, light against her jaw, a question rather than a claim. She felt her whole nervous system go very still and very alert at once. She didn't pull back. She put her hand over his and held it there for a moment against her cheek. Outside, the February light was failing over the harbor, going silver and cold, and the spruce trees were bending east in the evening wind the way they always did, the way they had been bending for 100 years on this coast, indifferent and permanent and quietly beautiful. Nessa Brault did not know yet what would come next. She knew she had no money and a hole in her boot and a past that had been largely unkind to her. She knew the spring thaw was 6 weeks out, and that she had told herself she'd reassess everything when the roads cleared. She also knew that she was sitting at a kitchen table in a warm house on the Nova Scotia coast, and that a man who had spent his own winter wages on a stranger had just touched her face, like she was something worth being careful with. She kept her hand over his. "I'll put the kettle on," she said quietly. He nodded and didn't move, and neither did she for a little while longer.